Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. We're going to go through some new news regarding AMD's graphics cards list. This comes to us courtesy of Zauba. So if you're not too familiar with Zauba, it actually tracks the imports and exports of various items through India, and it's worth noting that typically both Nvidia's range of hardware and AMD's hardware at some point or another will pop up. And in fact, of course, in the case of AMD, the country of origin is always Canada. So in these cases, it's likely that these are engineering samples and all of them are labelled printed circuit board assembly. Now there are actually 4 GPUs in question. The first one we're going to go through is known as Baffin. It was sent on the 16th of February 2016, and there are 3 others which we'll also talk about, and they were sent on the 8th of February, also of course 2016. So the first one that we should talk about is Baffin XT G5 4GB. Now it's a little bit tricky to actually read these in terms of actually getting super meaningful data from them, so all we can really do is speculate. The first, however, major clue is the fact that it does read as 4GB, which obviously immediately means that it's not one of the ultra high-end HBM2 GPUs, as we could probably guess by now. Now do remember that all prices are in Indian rupees, therefore when I tell you that this graphics card per unit is valued at around 48,000, don't have a heart attack. Do remember that just the 1st of February, once again this year, we did see another printed circuit board assembly. Unfortunately we don't have so many details with this one. It did not have, for example, the amount of memory on it, that type of thing. However, this one, price per unit, was actually 110,000. Once again, these are rupees. Now, there have been 4 of these sent out, 4 of these Baffin GPUs. So what is it? Well, it depends on your perspective, unfortunately. There are 2 trains of thought. The first is that it's a successor to Fiji. It's a high-end GPU, and it potentially could be something Polaris related. So it could be, for example, a mid-range Polaris board. The second option is that instead it's going to be more along the lines of the RX 470. And given the pricing, it would make some level of sense. Now I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but dude, is it really worth AMD releasing this range of GPUs? Well, honestly, yes, considering that we're still some way away from Polaris, and it depends also on how AMD want to play Polaris, if that made sense. So for the sake of argument, if they're going to release the very bleeding high-end GPUs first, then there's going to be some market for the mid to low range cards, which potentially this could hit. Now 4GB is certainly still a fairly substantial amount of memory. Now, before we continue this conjecture, I do want to actually put a little bit of a stamp on it, because there are 2 other cards, the Western X3 and the Western Pro S3. Now, these are definitely mid-range GPUs. That's without any question, because they come with 2GB of memory, and it doesn't really take a genius to figure out that they're probably going to be using GDDR5, which is pretty standard now, and of course graphics cards. Particularly because it's actually labelled to be 4.5 Gbps, which obviously means it's 4500 MHz clock, which once again strictly puts us into entry-level card territory. This is probably going to be one of the low-level cards that AMD are testing out, and ultimately, you know, depending upon your wants and desires, it probably won't be particularly interesting to you if you're wanting to play at something like 4K. It's a little confusing, however, because there is another one known as Banks Pro, and in fact many of the details of this card, at least in terms of the memory configuration, sound awfully familiar. It's still 2GB of memory and still clocked at the same 4500 MHz GDDR5. It's worth noting, however, that similar memory configurations ultimately don't necessarily equate to the same number of shaders, same number of ROPs, same clock speeds, that type of thing. However, it's fair to say that it's probably going to be like an R5 equivalent GPU, given how AMD are currently being rather aggressive with memory clocks and just the general design of AMD's cards as a whole. Another possibility, however, does exist when it comes to the Baffin that we did, of course, start this video out with. There are some who do believe it is a Polaris-based GPU, which may or may not be related to another story we put out a while back regarding the Polaris GPU's size, which is a 232mm² large die. This, of course, was leaked because of a profile from a senior engineer at AMD. Unfortunately, if this is really a link, it's down to your discretion. It's really down to your interpretation. And the problem that naturally comes to this is because a lot of these engineering samples aren't necessarily indicative of the final retail releases. I'll give you an example. There have been instances where cards were tested with completely different memory configurations than the final release, or it could be that the GPU is not fully assembled, it could be that it doesn't have the cooler, it could be it doesn't have the, it could be it doesn't have anything other than the basic components on the board. We just don't really know the state of them, and obviously you're not going to just be able to go up to the package and open it up, and unfortunately Zauba doesn't actually open up the package and take photos of it. I bloody wish they did, but they do not. So unfortunately all you can go with is some fairly ambiguous code names. Speaking of code names, one thing that you will have noticed is Pro X3 being pretty blatant. Pro X3 and G and XT. Now, your guess is as good as mine whether this actually means anything in reality. AMD have said that they want to clear up their naming conventions, and in fact this was one of the main reasons that they're starting to switch toward the Polaris architecture. Whether this is a code name that's going to remain for when it trickles down to retail, or whether it's just for internal shipping purposes, or whether it's just to confuse us, which is possible, let's face it. I mean, if you were to take a look at one of the names, it's bloody C98101 Baffin XT G5 4GB channel PN, and then you've got 102 C98101-00 FOC. Which is obviously pretty ambiguous, and you could certainly start making out some details. For example, 4GB, pretty obvious, but other parts not so obvious. What does all of this mean? It means that AMD are definitely getting closer towards the final goal of their cards. It means that they are shipping out a lot of GPUs, they're testing them, and they're starting to do so at ever increasing quantities. In fact, for the sake of argument, if we mosey back into the dawns of ancient past, also known as the 30th of January 2016, yes, a long time ago, they actually shipped out 48 GPUs. That's not small numbers, and actually, to be more specific, printed circuit board assemblies for personal computer video/graphics card. They actually shipped out 48 of the bastards, which are valued at about 2.3 million rupees, Indian rupees once again, and they have a value of 48,000. So whether these are related at all to the other cards which have just come out, by the way, there's a very small discrepancy in value, but that could be to do with inflation, it could, or rather just, exchange rates, or it could be that there's nothing at all to do with exchange rates. It could just simply be that there is something very tiny change on the card, or it could be a completely different GPU. Now, I know you're thinking to yourself at this point, well, does this bloody tell us anything? It does. It tells us that AMD are really working on this stuff, and that us as customers are going to be pretty happy. I think this is kind of exciting stuff, personally. I think it's a demonstration that both companies are being super aggressive, and as we heard just a few days ago from Nvidia, I don't want to go over the whole details again, but of course Nvidia have just had some series of details of their cards released, and their top-end card, assuming it is the top end, and it looks like it is, it's the equivalent of the 980 Ti or the Titan, something along those lines. They've got a floating point performance of like 12 T-flops, for the love of God. That is scary for a single precision card. And that, of course, is with Pascal. When Volta comes out, we're going to see an increase per watt of almost two times the amount of G-flops per watt. It's getting kind of insane, and I think that's why this generation of GPUs is really exciting me, because I think we're really going to start to see some movement in it. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Been a bit of a short one, this one, but it's just kind of how it is. Unfortunately, most of today has been setting up filming stuff, so hopefully you'll see the final result of that over the next few days. But for now, I'll see you later. Take care. Bye for now.